Being the new kid on the block, Ricky always wanted so badly to be liked by the neighborhood kids, so he paid no heed to their snickering when they told him to fetch the kickball that bounced over a neighbor's fence. He hadn't heard yet of any of the stories of the creepy old man had been traumatizing children for decades. He hopped the fence, spotted the ball, and rushed over to grab it, with his task half completed as he triumphantly headed back towards his new friends. That was when a tall, willowy wisp of a man came out from the side of the house with a garden hose. They just stood there staring at one another like some sort of standoff in an old western. In this scenario, Ricky was young and still wet behind the ears, cowpoke, twirling his pistols around like if they were toys. The elderly man was wizened, the old sheriff that could not hesitate to shoot down anybody that thought they could waltz into his own town and cause a ruckus. Before the boy could pull his pistols, so to speak, the old man squeezed the trigger and blasted him in the crotch. He laughed wildly as he blasted him in the face for good measure, as Ricky reached for his tender groin. The little damp boy just stood there in shock, with water dripping from his face and shorts. The older man just dropped the hose, gave Ricky an annoyed look, before leaning forward and uttering a quiet, raspy-voiced boo. Ricky then booked it for the fence, frantically scrambled over. He landed on the other side and ran as fast as he could. A moment later, the kickball he had forgotten in his panic escape bounced off the back of his head. He spun around to see the creepy old man towering over the fence. The crooked grin in his wrinkled old face told Ricky that he wasn't done with him yet. When he yelled at him at the line that made the boy's life a living hell for the next few weeks. "Hey, you brats! Stop pissing your pants in my yard!" The kids called him Trickle Rickle. After that, for the next month, the little boy wrestled for his control of his emotions. The neighborhood kids were brutal with name-calling, but the old man down the street affected him tenfold simply by sitting on his porch day in and day out, glaring out into the neighborhood. Every time Ricky peeled over past the wicked old man's house, that grit-worn face would turn toward him and stare at him in the eyes like two burning coals. The solution both his problems came to him one day was when he was blowing up balloons for his sister's birthday party. The Sunday, he gathered all the little kids in the neighborhood together. Amongst like all snickering and whispering utterances of Trickle Rickle, he handed out the water balloons, like a scene from Braveheart. He had admonished their enemy and called them to arms with railing cry, "Mr. Withers must die." The old man nearly swallowed his black and mild cigar more when a dozen of kids rushed over to his yard and began slinging water grenades at him. He stood up in protest, but that only made an easier target. He angrily swung around his cane and shouted profanities until he was completely soaked from head to foot, except for a little area on the small back that somehow managed to stay dry. Barge finally ended up when the kids scattered with yips of laughter, echoing throughout the neighborhood. Ricky hid in a bush across the street and watched the whole battle unfold. With a few dollars from his piggy bank and a bike ride to the store, he had engineered the first step to get his campaign to end Mr. Rivers' region of terror. He had thought for sure the old grump would tuck his tail between his legs and stagger inside, but the stubborn old coot just sat back down, lit another cigar, and acted as if nothing bad had happened. Nobody had called him Trickle Rickle after that. Many more maneuvers were planned to be executed on May Street, and that summer with Ricky directing them all to Miss Tamalage, who unfortunately lived next door to the old man, was baffled at how the neighbor kids managed to afford dozens of plastic pink flamingo lawn ornaments and decorate his yard with. This was definitely her favorite prank of the summer, covering his front porch with plastic wrap, filling the makeshift pen with toads, and with the thing of a genius that gave the mailman a chuckles for the week. Many of the residents secretly enjoyed perfectly harmless and intervened pranks that plagued the neighborhood grump. Eventually, the parents of the neighborhood stepped in and called a ceasefire, but they certainly took their time doing so. Some of them had suffered the hands of Mr. Rivers when they were kids as well. That's right. The bitter old man spent decades honing nothing over his special brand of mean. Punishments were dished out to every child involved, ushered up to Mr. Rivers' front step, and made to apologize. It physically hurt Ricky deep in his gut to apologize. What really bothered him the most was that the old fogey didn't even remember him. He was just many of the faceless kids guy that harassed over the years. The old grump was just sat there soaking it all up with his superiority stamped on his face. The lesson Ricky had learned that day wasn't the intended one. From that point forward, he plotted and acted alone, except for Halloween. A few dog turds tragically placed in his mailbox never gave the old man whiff or impropriety of the part of the neighborhood kids. A pail of salt water periodically dumped on his garden in the middle of the night only made him snatch his head in frustration. With that year's wimpy squash shield, the number 9 on the front of this house kept falling off and altering his letters and address, was just as many of the little nuisances that cooped up ever since unknowingly he made an enemy of the little boy down the street. Mr. Rivers' actual name was Gerald P. Cromer, but the kids had given him a far too long ago to remember fit him like a glove. His thin, wavering white hair waved in the breeze, looking as if it would pull free from the scalp at any moment and go in search of all the strands that had escaped from years before. Plenty of elderly people go out fat, but not Mr. Rivers. He was almost lamppost and just as skinny. He seemed to be sway on his feet, like a tall blade of grass when he just ventured to his mailbox. Ricky had wished many times throughout his childhood that the mean old man would just blow away on the heavy wind and leave the kids of the neighborhood to play at peace. Some of those kids who'd grown up, moved away many, many years ago, started the myth that Mr. Rivers' hair was alive and it wrinkled and withered whenever there wasn't a breeze. I'm pretty sure you can imagine how a freaky detail like that could take of its life of its own amongst children who still feared monsters under their beds, behind the closed doors. Typical stories of him being a vampire or even a werewolf ran rampant amongst the sense of imaginable children. Some had said his wrath that wouldn't let go of his word. He certainly looked like one. Others believed that he escaped from the insane asylum because he could no longer ignore his insatiable hunger for the misery of innocent children. Ricky could never confirm anything supernatural or criminal about the old man, but he just saw him as a mean old grump that deserved whatever bad thing came to his way. He was still young to understand the karma and revenge that wasn't so nom-noms for one another. The mischievous boy was well aware of how cruel some kids could be, but he never witnessed outright cruelty from an adult until the next he met Mr. Rivers. It was something that everyone learns eventually. Ricky might have learned a little lesson, a little too soon for the fragile minds to handle. The angry little boy was just playing with fire, fostering bitterness that would eventually consume him if he didn't find any way to douse it. Gerald P. Cromer had been living in the neighborhood for nearly 60 years. His wife had only lasted 18. Every morning he would step into the bathroom, get ready for the day, and the memories of his wife would visit him. Adina had known what the kind of man Gerald was when she married him, but she truly believed that she could change him. He really hadn't been a bad husband. He doted on her and gave her everything she ever wanted, except for one thing. Eventually, she just gave up on convincing him that adoption was perfectly a viable option for couples like them. Over the years, she grew less and less interested in the day-to-day affairs like cooking, cleaning, even basic hygiene. Her laziness, as he called it, sparked up many arguments. He never laid a hand on her. She eventually did that herself. Idina's exit was via bathtub come one day when Gerald was out of town doing his business. Images of the scene he came home to that horrible day, almost 40 years ago, greeted him on mornings when his guard was lowered. On the rare occasions he sat at the edge of the bathtub, looking into it, and he sobbed like he had done something awful that day many years ago. On those days he couldn't bring himself to step foot in the tub, disheveled and yet feeling lost. He eventually made his way onto the front porch, where he spent most of his time smoking and making the snide judgments, mostly to himself and the microcosms that were in the suburban life. But there were those days where they were just most likely a rail against his wood. The spoiled, snot-nosed brats, and littered the neighborhood like little bits of garbage. His seeing rants on those days always created the latest work for the myth of the decrepit monster of all men and children called Mr. Rivers. Halloween was coming soon, and he soon couldn't wait for it to pass. He hated the holiday with a passion, even before he put it. The snot-nosed hooligans in his run-down neighborhood started defacing my property. He then put an end to it last year and didn't figure any of them would be brazen enough to try it again. Still, he'd still be staying on his sentinel on this porch at night, primed to swing his cane at any stupid kid enough to step on his porch with a bag of dog shit and a lighter. He stood up swinging his cane at particularly at nothing and yelled to the neighborhood, "You rotten little punks better stay clear this year if you want to know what's good for you." No one appeared to be out of the neighborhood at that moment, but it didn't matter to Gerald. He still knew that brat still instigated the pumpkin tossing 2 years ago, within almost an earshot somewhere nearby. He was the only kid that didn't cross to the far side of the street yet to pass his house. Sometimes he would even park his bike on the sidewalk and glare up at him. He was still wise to know one of his antics when he spotted him a while back dumping a soup can of slugs in his garden, and it dawned on him as to why his strawberries had done so poorly the year before. He didn't even recognize him at the time, but now he was convinced he'd seen them before. Of course, he couldn't really be sure at all. They had looked at him, except for Tammy Swanson, whom liked to yell, "Eat a salad!" at when she passed by. When he was a child, he respected his elders and feared for them as well, but it seems to incline on the children was fear. That was fine by him. He supposed fear was the kind of respect. He was convinced kids at these days didn't even know what the word respect meant anyway. They always needed a healthy bit of fear drummed into them to know again to keep in their pace, even though he felt like it was the parents' fault that their kids were such little jerks. He stuck into the strategy that he always used, terrorizing their children. "Idiot kids nearly burned my house down with all those little damn orange projectiles. Useless vegetable, the pumpkin. You think that you would have fought to put candles on them before they went tossing them into my bushes? It's a sad world we lived in when the parents are too busy trying to be their best buddies instead teaching their kids proper behavior. Seen and not heard was the rule in my day." His thoughts then went on like that, within a word or two occasionally blurted out loud, until he went inside to try and take a shit. Ricky then poked his head out for the corner of the house, counted to 10, and quietly slipped onto the porch. He tossed Gerald's cigars into the bushes, dumped his drink, scattered a few cat hairs on the table, and then stole away as he quietly come. The strategy of 1,000 annoyance, he called it, was his favorite pastime, and what he would have loved most about it was the old fart didn't even have a clue all those little accidents over the years weren't anything of that sort. Ricky's favorite month of the year was in full swing. He had been racking his brain for the punishment to trick off his final year of trick-or-treating. Mr. Rivers was going to get at him more than time, and he was just going to get good if Ricky had been anything to do about it. He nearly bubbled over with excitement every time the idea came to mind, but nothing yet seemed to be right. He was going to hit Mr. Grit away from my lawn house so hard the neighborhood would still be talking about it when he set off for college. It didn't even matter to Ricky if his parents grounded him till then. He was dead on set, and nothing was going to stop him. He was small for his age, but his ability to outwit sixth graders, some adults as well, and come up with creative pranks to put him at the top of the food chain of his 5th grade class. Kids listened to him, and you could even say they feared him. His teacher, Miss Volkol, often remarked to her colleagues, "I see a bright future in politics for that one." In less than 3 months into the school year, he had already brought her nearly tears twice. She was strongly considering retiring next year. Last October, the grumpy old man had gotten a respective because of Paul Clark, who had forgotten to extinguish his candle on his jack-o'-lantern the year before. Ricky had shamed Paul at school the next year for screwing up his trick and sent him to eat lunch alone for the rest of the week. Next year, he reminded Paul of this screwed-up that made him sit somewhere else for the entire month of October. One day while Ricky was pulling out a rusty nail out of a 2x4 to hammer one to Mr. Wiver's car tires, the perfect trick had just popped to his head. Actually, it was two Ricks. While he enacted the prank in hand, he thought about the details of his ultimate Halloween trick. It involved a maneuver that he had learned about in history class called the fint. Halloween was fast approaching, and he needed everyone on board if his plan was going to work. So he forgave Paul for his past mistake. The kid had been punished enough, and Ricky figured letting him out of this doghouse would make him more amenable to a special task he made for him. There was no way Ricky was going to let Old Man Withers off the hook this year. No way in hell. Gerald would have bought a dye surveillance system years ago if he had known they had become inexpensive. It paid for itself for just 2 days after he installed it. The footage of Ricky sneaking into his home through the back door while he sat on the front porch sent him to boiling. He could barely keep up rushing down the street, confronting the boy with proof of his crime. But he held himself in check as he scrutinized every second of the eye-opening video. Gerald watched as the kid slinking in through the kitchen, poking his pinholes in various packages of food. He now knew why his bread always got stale so quickly, and why the freezer burnt was also prevalent amongst the other steaks of burger patties. Witnessing the kid shake and appeared to be an empty jar over the basket, fruits and vegetables, suddenly solved the fruit fly mystery he had been scratching his head out for so long. The old man paced back and forth onto the front monitor, growing angrier and angrier in every little inconvenience. His life was proven to be at the work of a mischievous brat that was entering the stages of puberty. He even decided to wait until he caught him on camera to enact his plan. He figured that the kid would strike on Halloween and would take the damning evidence over to the police station the next morning and put it into the defunct pranks once and for all. He rushed over to the house and buy more cameras so he could cover every room. Ricky had gotten sloppy a couple weeks back, believing a handprint on the back door that Gerald noticed was too small to be his own. That's how easily you can lose the upper hand. Disney princesses, pirates, zombies, vampires, goblins, space aliens, and all sorts of colorful Atari characters danced through the neighborhood. Ricky was the exception of his no-frills ghost costume. He had a slit in the back so he could easily slip the up, top, and down to show everyone that he was also on the hunt for candy. Once he had made his presence known, he gathered enough candy to complete his end bill, and he quietly slipped into the woods to meet up with Paul. Just as Ricky predicted, Paul was willing enough to skip the first hour or so of candy gathering, if it meant redeemed of himself in the eyes of being his friend. Being shunned since last October had seriously injured his self-esteem to the point where he would have done just about anything to get back on the good graces of his group of friends. He didn't go trick-or-treating last year because no one wanted him around, so he wouldn't be missed this year. He quickly donned Ricky's white sheet, repeated the instructions, and rushed off to trick-or-treat with his friend's steed. Ricky, dressed all in black, rushed off to scope out the old man's house and waited for the signal. It had taken a lot of painstaking effort to find the 5 well-hidden beauties that were going to do most of the work for him. Their gobbler black and red abdomens reflected in Ricky's eyes and inspected them once by one with their glass prison. He made sure that the lid was tightly closed and then slipped the jar back into his backpack. He quietly came up from his backyard, snuck into the side of the house, and peeked through the corner. The old man was sitting on his porch in the dark like a trapdoor spider, waiting for some unsuspecting prey to come near its entrance. The tip of his cigar came to life for one fiery second, illuminating the permanent scowl on his face. Then it faded, and he exhaled as a puff of smoke. He stared out all the children, going door to door while their parents following along the sides of the sidewalk to their own place. A flicker of movement in the corner of the old man's eye as a wicked smile came to his face as Ricky slipped out of sight and headed towards the back door. He tightly clenched his cane in both his hands and considered going to decide to catch him in the act, but decided to stick to his plan. As far as he was concerned, the move he was making exposed the whole neighborhood for a great argument was doing away and all the new age indulgence for favor of the traditional style of living. He figured it was worth missing a cracking the kid's open head with the metal tip of his walking stick. It eventually pleased the old man to have everyone last target focus on Vizirion. He could strike at everyone and everything, despite the short trip to the police station. He was convinced that the kid was responsible for every little aggravation he endured for the last few years. Actually, his feeble, bitter, and irrational old mind blamed Ricky for the very bad thing that never happened to him. It wasn't really anything new, though Mr. Kramer's view was that the children had been there to the very point of his life to frustrate, antagonize, and shame him, and now he hoped that it would be the quilty and quaint of ghosts in his head. A loud crack sounded off the side of his house. Gerald posted off his cane and rose to his feet as an egg exploded from against the porch railing, scattered to bits of yolk and shells all over his pants. The old man reached down and deep into himself and pulled out the strength of hoodlums expected. He rushed to the steps, shouting every nasty epithet he knew, and he bounded down them much quicker than anyone expected, effectively crippling their assault, sending the kids fleeing in every direction. Ricky had told them that they have nearly a minute for them to strike from the sidewalk, because it took a little later than 2 minutes for the feeble old man to get to his mailbox. And it didn't take into the account of what adrenaline-fueled rage could accomplish even a freebie old man. The kid was supposed to climb through the side railing of the porch and lock the door, chickened out, and then ran. Ricky's assault plan was floundering, and he was for sure it would go off without a hitch, that it didn't account for a shorter amount of time to accomplish his secret task inside. Mr. Withers then looked 10 times more frightening than Tammy Swanson had ever seen him looked before. The enraged Mr. Rivers was on her back before she could do more than to turn and run. His cane then took her behind her knee and quickly cracked her across the ass as she toppled onto her knees. He raised his cane up high as he could to bring it down on her ass again, but his left leg buckled underneath him. He managed to stay upright, but the chubby preteen had crawled to the sidewalk and gotten her feet out by the time he steadied himself. She crouched down there and tangled her mummy bandages, looking pathetic as a cow caught in barbed wire fence, wiping the tears from her eyes. She looked at the tip of the cane that just brought down on one of her bandages that lay on his feet. He relinquished a bit of her costume, just as she grabbed it and yanked it as hard as she could. She went over to her heels, back over it, and toppled onto a tree lawn. Mr. Rivers covered the distance between them and then came to a stop before her, just as she rose out of her hands and knees. She began to bawl out her eyes as the shadow completely engulfed her shivering form. His shadow casted over seemed to be darker in her room at bedtime. She had given up all the pretense of getting away, but the old man snorted like a pig, delivered a line that she would repeat to herself to shrink her years later. "Go back to your waddle, little piggy." He then continued to snort and squeal as he turned and hobbled back to his porch, leaning heavily on his cane. At the full rage-fueled strength and drained out of him, he was just an old man again. But by the time he floppled back to his heavy on his chair, Tammy was nowhere to be seen, and the street was empty. He laughed out loud the realization it was him that sent the kids and adults home, like scurrying off to some quieter part of the neighborhood. Only Mr. Rivers would openly beat a child and get off without further alteration. He rested his head on the against the back of his chair and muttered, "It's good to be king." He just lit a cigar and gave it a few puffs to get it burning brightly. Then just then a scream followed by a sound of shattering glass came from inside the house.